On March 17, 1982, when Springs DeGello began to reveal the secrets of the harsh winter in the hills of Ozark, in Missouri, an assistant social called Margaret Wilson visited an isolated cabin inside the county from Shannon. What she found would forever change her understanding of the limits social isolation and the consequences of institutional neglect in American rural communities. The property of the Sheltons was 27 kilometers from the nearest city, Current River. Accessible only by a dirt road that became impassable during spring rains, the family lived virtually without contact with the world exterior for over 3 decades. Margaret's visit was motivated by a complaint anonymous received by the Missouri Department of Social Services, claiming that children were living in unhealthy conditions and possibly suffering abuse. Upon arriving at the property, Margaret was received by Elijah Shelton, 47, a man of median stature, grey beard, and intense blue eyes that seemed carry the weight of generations of isolation. Elijah lived in the cabin with his sister, Martha Shelton, 43, and 3 children, Thomas, 12, Sadie, 9, and little Jacob, only 5 years. The cabin, built by Elijah's grandfather in the 1920s, was a structure of wood with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room. The property included a small barn, a vegetable garden, and a well. There was no electricity or water piped. Isolation was almost total, with occasional trips to the city to buy supplies they couldn't produce. The climate that day was mild, with a temperature of 17 degrees C and partially cloudy. The recent defrost had left the floor around the muddy cabin, and the air he carried the characteristic smell of wetland and decaying wood. During the initial inspection, Margaret noticed that the children showed signs of light malnutrition and lack of basic medical care. Thomas had a bad scar healed on the right arm, the result of an axe accident the previous year. Sadie had a light strabism that had never been treated. Jacob, the youngest, showed signs of delay in cognitive development for his age. What caught the attention of Margaret, however, were the physical similarities between the children and the 2 adults. All shared striking features: the same intense blue eyes, the same facial bone structure, the same format of ear, characteristics that suggested not only kinship, but also a very close consanguinity. When asked about the children's mother, Elijah hesitated for a moment before to answer that his wife had died during Jacob's delivery. Martha. It remained silent, avoiding eye contact with the social worker. It was in this moment Margaret began to suspect that the story made no sense. County records did not find any wedding certificate from Elijah Shelton. In fact, the only documents found were the certificates of birth of Elijah and Martha, sons of Harold and Edith Shelton, and a record of ownership of lands dated 1924. The children had no certificates of official birth. The Shelton family was gradually isolated after the death of Elijah and Martha's parents in a fire in 1973. Since then, the brothers have cut almost every bond with the local community, visiting the city for basic needs only. Current River residents described Elijah as a reserved and suspicious man that avoided prolonged interactions. The first suspicions that Martha could be the biological mother of children began to form in Margaret's mind as she observed the dynamics familiar. The way Jacob clung to Martha's skirts, how intuitively knew the needs of each child, and how his gaze revealed a deep maternal bond that went beyond that of an aunt. If you want to follow more cases like this, which shake society as a whole and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any investigation. The formal investigation of the Shelton case began on March 24, 1982, a week after Margaret Wilson's initial visit. The Department of Social Services from Missouri, in conjunction with the Shannon County Sheriff, sent a team to evaluate the situation. The team consisted of Margaret, the policeman David Tanner, and Dr. Robert Hayes, pediatrician. The first obstacle the team found was Elijah's resistance. When confronted with more direct questions about the origin of children, he put himself in the defensive, claiming that the authorities had no right to interfere with life of your family. "We take care of ours," he repeated, a phrase that later would reveal loaded with disturbing meaning. Martha, in turn, remained silent, responding only with monosyllables when questioned directly. As settings demonstrated a mix of curiosity and fear in relation to visitors, demonstrating their limited contact with people outside the family core. Dr. Hayes performed basic physical examinations on children and observed several signs worrying. In addition to mild malnutrition and lack of preventive medical care, he observed physical characteristics that could indicate genetic problems consistent with endogamy. Thomas had polydactyly, one more finger in hand left. Sadie had problems of dental development, and Jacob presented signs of cognitive impairment more severe than initially perceived. These signs, when observed in isolation, can have several causes, explained Dr. Hayes in his report. But when observed together, added to the shared physical characteristics and family isolation, raise serious concerns about possible consanguinity. The investigation took a more accurate course when the team obtained access to few medical records of the family. In 1970, Martha had been treated in a hospital in the neighboring county after a domestic accident. The doctor he had observed that she was 3 months pregnant. However, not there was record of birth or adoption of any child during this period. A deeper search in the records revealed a standard. Martha had been treated in different hospitals in the region in 1970, 1973, and 1977, years that they would correspond approximately at the ages of Thomas, Sadie, and Jacob. In each occasion, she used different names, but physical descriptions and medical data basic indicated that it was the same person. The investigation found a significant obstacle when Elijah, feeling the direction of events, prevented investigators from entering the property. Legally, without concrete evidence of abuse or severe neglect, the authorities, they had limited intervention options. It was at this moment that a crucial witness emerged. Sarah Jenkins, a woman 83 years old who lived about 5 kilometers from Shelton's property. He contacted Margaret after hearing rumors about the investigation. Sarah? He revealed that he was a friend of Edith, Elijah, and Martha's mother, and that she kept contact sporadic with family even after isolation. Edith was always afraid that something like this would happen, said Sarah. Harold kept the family isolated, saying that the world was corrupt and that they could only trust in the blood itself. When they died in that fire, I tried to help boys, but Elijah was already very similar to his father, suspicious, hostile. Sarah revealed that she had visited the cabin a few times after the death of her parents, carrying supplies and offering assistance. In one of these visits in 1971, he noticed that Martha was visibly pregnant. When she questioned him about it, Elijah expelled her from the property and forbade her to return. I should have done something at that time, lamented Sarah, but who would you believe me? And where would these children stop? The system does not take good care of ours here. Sarah's testimony provided an important context, but it was not proof definitive. The investigation needed concrete evidence to intervene. A turnaround occurred when one of the agents revised the birth records of Elijah and Martha and discovered something intriguing. Your parents, Harold and Edith Shelton, they shared the same surname before marriage. Subsequent investigations, they revealed that they were first cousins. It is not uncommon in isolated communities like this, explained the local historian consulted by the team. In the early decades of the 20th century, many families in mountainous regions lived so isolated that marriages between relatives nearby ended up happening for lack of options. In some cases, this made almost a family tradition, justified by beliefs about purity of blood. This discovery shed new light on the case. It was not just a possible incestuous relationship between Elijah and Martha, but potentially of a standard generational endogamy that intensified throughout the generations. The team has developed a new theory. The parents of Elijah and Martha, already cousins, they transmitted isolationist beliefs to their children. After the death of the parents, the brothers, already socially isolated and possibly influenced by distorted ideas on family and purity, established an incestuous relationship that resulted in the birth of 3 children. The investigation found an obstacle when a local resident claimed to have seen a different woman on Shelton's property in the early 1970s. Information briefly reinforced the theory that there could be a third person involved, perhaps an Elijah wife, who later disappeared. Note, however, subsequent investigations have revealed that the witness probably had confused the property or the date. The sheriff, John Pearson, in relation to the allegations, began to consider obtaining a court order to collect children's DNA samples and of the adults. However, the legal process would be complicated, especially considering the isolation of the family and the lack of conclusive evidence of abuse or neglect that justified such an invasive intervention. "We have to act carefully here," argued the sheriff. "These people live so there are generations. For them, this is their normal way of life. If we invade property without concrete evidence, we can lose any chance of helping these children." The investigation reached an impasse that would last several months. During that period, the Department of Social Services maintained regular visits to the property, monitoring the well-being of children and, gradually, trying to build a relationship of trust with the family. The real turnaround in the Shelton case occurred in September 1982, 6 months after the investigation began. During one of your routine visits to the property, Margaret Wilson noticed that Jacob, the youngest, had high fever and presented signs of a severe respiratory infection. Despite Elijah's initial resistance, she managed to convince him to allow the child to be taken to the hospital in West Plains, the largest and next city. At the hospital, Dr. Michael Brennan, a genetic specialist who had been consulted on the case, took the opportunity to perform more deepened, with the reluctant consent of Elijah, who accompanied the son. Results of Jacob exams revealed multiple subtle congenital anomalies that individually they could have gone unnoticed, but together they formed a consistent pattern with a high degree of consanguinity. "The genetic markers we are observing here," Dr. Brennan told research team, "are typical of children born in relationships between first-degree brothers. There is excessive homozygosis for a relationship between cousins, even first-degree cousins." During the 2 weeks of Jacob's hospitalization due to complications of pneumonia, Martha remained constantly by her side, demonstrating a maternal care and striking anxiety. It was during this period that Martha, exhausted physically and emotionally, finally began to open with Margaret. One night, while Jacob slept under the influence of medicines, Martha shared fragments of his story. She talked about the growing isolation after the death of parents, as Elijah gradually assumed the role of patriarch family, and how the limits between family roles began to be confused. "We didn't know anyone," Martha confessed, in an almost inaudible whisper. "Elijah said the outside world wanted to separate us, hurt us. We could trust each other." Although Martha has not explicitly admitted to being the biological mother of children, in this conversation, your words and emotions made the situation increasingly clear to Margaret. The social worker, taking extreme care not to break the fragile confidence that was being established, avoided asking direct questions about the paternity, focusing on offering emotional support. Meanwhile, documentary investigation continued. A significant advance occurred when the researchers located a traveling pastor, the Reverend Samuel Miller, who had visited isolated communities in the hills of Ozark during the 1960s and 1970s. The Reverend Miller kept detailed daily visits, including observations on the families I found. At an entrance dated June 1969, he described a visit to the property of Shelton. "I visited the Shelton family today. Your parents recently died in circumstances tragic, leaving 2 adult children, Elijah, 34, and Martha, 30. I found them living in extreme poverty and isolation. I offered spiritual and material assistance, but I was received with suspicion, especially by the young Elijah. Something in the dynamics between the brothers seemed disturbing to me. Martha looked submissive, almost fearful. Tamer that without the moderating influence of their parents, as isolationists as they were, the situation can deteriorate. I intend to go back, but I confess that I was feeling powerless." A later entrance from April 1971 was even more revealing. "I returned to Shelton property after almost 2 years. I was prevented from entering by Elijah, who seemed even more hostile and paranoid. From afar, I could see Martha briefly. She seemed to be in an advanced state of pregnancy. When I mentioned this to Elijah, suggesting that they might need medical attention, he was furious, accusing me of spreading lies and threatening to assault me if I was not, although immediately. I reported my concerns to the local sheriff, but they said that without concrete evidence of abuse, nothing could be done. These mountains keep their secrets, and I fear that some of them are too dark to support the light of day. Reverend Miller's diary provided the first contemporary evidence of Martha's pregnancy, corroborating suspicions of the investigation. Another crucial event occurred when the authorities managed to locate medical records from a Springfield hospital where Martha had been treated in 1977 under the name Mary Smith. The records confirmed that it had been hospitalized in advanced labor and given to lighter boy with multiple health complications, including breathing problems and a slight cardiac defect. The date of birth coincided with the approximate age of Jacob. The medical team of the time noticed concerns about possible abnormalities genetic and suggested more tests, but Mary Smith left the hospital against the medical advice as soon as your condition and that of the baby stabilized. While Jacob recovered at the hospital, Dr. Brennan, with Judicial Authorization Limited, performed additional examinations that revealed that the boy had a condition rare genetics called Apert syndrome, characterized by skull malformations, face, hands, and feet. This syndrome can occur spontaneously, but its incidence increases significantly in cases of close consanguinity. Based on the new evidence, Judge Eleanor Simmons issued a warrant authorizing DNA tests in all Shelton children and adults. The results, obtained in November 1982, they were conclusive. Elijah was the biological father, and Martha, the biological mother of the 3 children. Leave a comment. Never give up on the truth if you believe all cases of family abuse deserve to be investigated, no matter how isolated the community. On December 7, 1982, based on genetic evidence and testimonials collected, Elijah Shelton was formally accused of incest, a Class D crime in Missouri, punishable with up to 4 years in prison. Martha, considered victim due to evidence of prolonged psychological coercion, it did not face accusations criminal, but their ability to take care of the children was questioned in court. Elijah Shelton's trial began in February 1983, and attracted significant regional media attention, despite efforts to keep the case relatively discreet and protect the privacy of children. The Shannon County Court. He hosted one of the most complex and morally challenging cases in his history. During the trial, Elijah's defense, led by public defender Gerald Thompson, he argued that extreme isolation and the dysfunctional environment in which he had been created had compromised their ability to discern norms, basic social and morals. Thompson presented evidence that Harold and Edith Shelton, parents of Elijah and Martha, had deliberately isolated their children, depriving them of formal education and normal social contact. The defendant, argued Thompson, is the product of isolation generations and possibly from previous endogamy. He himself is the son of first cousins who created him believing that the outside world was hostile and that the family should remain introspective. The accusation, represented by Amanda Lewis, recognized the circumstances attenuating, but maintained that Elijah understood the nature of his actions. The defendant demonstrated the ability to interact with the community when necessary, to conduct basic business, and deliberately hide the true nature of its relationship with the sister, Lewis argued. These are not someone's actions unable to distinguish right from wrong. Martha Shelton witnessed to closed doors. Excerpts edited from his testimony, subsequently disclosed, they revealed a pattern of psychological manipulation that began after the death of her parents when she was 29 and Elijah 33. According to Martha, Elijah gradually assumed full control over all aspects of its lives, isolating it more and more and convincing it that the outside world it represented a threat to its safety and family unit. "He told us we were special," said Martha, "that our blood was pure, that our children would be strong because they would not be contaminated by the world outdoor. At first I resisted, but after years alone with him, I started to believe." Dr. Richard Foster, a psychiatrist specializing in social and dynamic isolation abusive family members, witnessed as an expert, explaining to the jury the deep effects of extreme isolation and prolonged indoctrination. What we see here is a classic case of an alternative reality built by isolation. When one person is systematically excluded from all normative social references, their perception of what is acceptable can be radically distorted. The trial also highlighted the failure of local institutions to identify and intervene in the situation. The evidence revealed that concerns were expressed by -3 different people over the years: the Reverend Miller, the neighboring Sarah Jenkin S., and an employee of the Current River supply store, who noticed similarities between children and adults who occasionally visited the store. In neither case was proper follow-up by the authorities, revealing systemic failures in monitoring isolated communities and in protection of vulnerable people in remote rural areas. After 2 weeks of testimonials, the jury considered Elijah Shelton guilty of incest, but recommended cleaning due to attenuating circumstances. The judge, Eleanor Simmons, sentenced him to 3 years in prison, with the possibility of freedom conditional after 18 months, and ordered compulsory psychological treatment. In her final statement, Judge Simmons noted, "This case represents a collective failure, not just the defendant, who is still responsible for his actions, but of a society that allows entire families to be set aside by our protection and support systems." Geographical isolation should not mean institutional abandonment. As for children, the court ordered them to remain temporarily under state custody, while Martha received intensive psychological treatment. The ultimate goal was family reunification, since Martha showed capacity to properly take care of children and keep them integrated into the community in general. The children were placed in a foster home in the neighboring county, where began to receive formal education and medical treatment for their various conditions. Thomas, the eldest, demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability, rapidly reaching your colleagues in educational terms, despite the delay initial. Sadie had more difficulties with social adaptation, but responded well to treatment for your strabismus and other health problems. Jacob, the youngest and more severely affected by genetic disorders, underwent several surgeries to correct malformations and started intensive care for its delay in development. Comprehensive genetic tests revealed that all 3 children were carriers of multiple genetic anomalies resulting from endogamy. Thomas presented mainly smaller problems, such as polydactyly, which had already been corrected surgically, and predisposition to certain autoimmune diseases. Sadie presented more significant problems, including a rare enzymatic deficiency that affected his metabolism and required continuous medication. Jacob, as previously identified, suffered from Apert syndrome, among other complications that would require care doctors for a lifetime. The Shelton case triggered significant changes in service policies in Missouri and neighboring states. The Shelton Law, approved by State Legislative Assembly in 1985, established more rigorous protocols for the monitoring of families in isolated areas, including regular visits of social workers and wellness checks for all children, regardless of formal complaints. Elijah Shelton fulfilled 22 months of his sentence before being released in freedom conditional in 1985. As a condition for its liberation, he was prohibited from returning family ownership while children were under the care of Martha, and had to undergo continuous therapy and regular supervision. Martha, after 2 years of intensive care, recovered the Children's Guard in 1984. With state assistance, he moved to a small house on the outskirts of West Plains, where children were able to continue their studies and medical treatment. She completed her own GED, high school equivalent diploma, and finally, he got a job as a library assistant in a local library. The history of the Shelton family continued to evolve in the following decades. Thomas, the eldest son, surpassed the adversities of his creation and graduated in service social, dedicating their career to help children in situations of vulnerability similar. Sadie faced more difficulties, fighting chronic problems, health and psychological challenges related to your past, but it ended up finding stability as an artist and artisan. Jacob, despite its limitations, physical and cognitive, conquered a semi-independent life with the support of community and became a defender of the rights of people with disabilities in rural areas. The Shelton case remains an iconic study at faculties of social work and right across the country, illustrating the complex intersections between isolation, geographic, rural poverty, dysfunctional family dynamics, and institutional failures. Also highlights the physical and psychological effects of endogamy, not just in children directly affected, but also in subsequent generations. In 2002, 20 years after the initial discovery, Margaret Wilson, then retired, reflected on the case in an interview with a local newspaper. What's most impressive, looking back, it's like something so extreme could happen practically in sight of all. No, it was a cabin in the middle of nowhere, was less than 30 kilometers from a city, in a country with resources and institutions allegedly capable of protecting the vulnerable. It makes us think how many other similar cases exist, hidden in remote valleys or the view of all, hoping someone pays attention. Shelton's original property, abandoned for years, was eventually sold by state in 1990. The cabin collapsed over time, but the earth remains, a silent reminder of how extreme isolation can distort realities and perpetuate damage cycles for generations. If you have watched here, it is because you care about these cases that mark families forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so that I can know who really cares about the search for the truth. Do not forget to enjoy this video and share it with those who also value the understanding of the complexities of human nature and the importance of effective protection systems. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now to follow more investigations of cases that make us reflect on our society and collective responsibility.